Cool. So welcome everyone to the first installment of the Australian Hegel Society's Hegel in Classical German Philosophy Talks series. This series will run at least for a year and aims to host talks by international classical German philosophy experts working on a variety of issues, topics, and themes. The talks will be occurring every 2 months, and barring some unforeseen disaster, our next one will take place in February. Currently, I can share with you, though this list is not yet fully set in stone, that we'll be hearing from the likes of Dalia Nassar, Luca Literati, Elisa Magri in the coming year. But first things first. To open this talk series, we are lucky to have with us today Associate Professor Gregory Moss. Dr. Moss teaches at the Chinese University of Hong Kong and is probably known by most of you here today due to his absolutely stunning book, Hegel's Foundation-Free Metaphysics. But luckily for us, and it is also to his great credit that his work and interest extends far beyond the usual ambit that many Hegelians working in the Anglosphere feel comfortable in. His work deals not only with Schelling, who we'll be hearing about today, but also with Christian Neoplatonism, and perhaps most excitingly, the philosophy of the Kyoto School and Japanese philosophy a little bit more generally. I hope that this brief little introduction, though of course you already knew who he was, serves to indicate both why we and the Australian Hegel Society feel so grateful that Dr. Moss would share his time with us today and why he is the perfect person to open this talk series. Today his talk is entitled The Contingency of Existence in Schelling's Positive Philosophy, which he'll present for about an hour or so, I hear, and then we can move to having a discussion afterwards. So please do keep any questions till the end. And with that, I can hand it over to the man himself. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you very much, Daniel, for the very kind introduction. And I'm very happy to be here with you today and very happy to share with you some of my thoughts on Schelling's late philosophy, in particular his positive philosophy. So without further ado, I'm just going to jump in. So my focus today is on Schelling's late philosophy, his so-called positive philosophy. And in particular, I'm going to be focusing on these Berlin lectures from the early 1840s. I'm going to be kind of honing in on one main question that seems to motivate the text. This main question is, why is there anything at all? Why is there not nothing? Now, this question that Schelling asks early on in the lectures is really a question he's been asking a long time. It's a question he asked throughout his whole career. And you can see the same question being asked in the 1790s in his Philosophische Briefe. He says the main task of all philosophy consists in solving the problem of the existence of the world. So the existence of the world is a problem. Why is there a world? Why are there things? Why are there determined entities that exist in the world? So this is a question that spans throughout all of Schelling's career. So Schelling's philosophy sometimes is difficult to really get a grapple on because he doesn't hold the same position throughout his whole career. And so one has to track these transformations, but there is a consistency to a large extent in the question itself, at least in a number of the questions, one of which is, why is there anything at all? Now, Schelling seems to think that this question is not only his own, but is in fact a question shared by his contemporaries. He says, to the question why there are such entities, there was no answer, speaking of pre-critical philosophy. The answer of the existence of such beings was not realized. The great turnaround of more recent times constituted precisely because of the fact that no one no longer aims for the predicates, but that one demands to become certain of the thing itself, the Gegenstände. Contemporary philosophy involves the derivation of the things themselves, which in the earlier metaphysics were quite simply assumed from your experience of the general consciousness. So rather than primarily focus on what it is to be and the properties of those things, what we want to know is why there is anything at all. So we are interested, according to Schelling, in the properties of thinghood or what it is to be something, but most primarily what we're interested in is why there is a thing at all. Okay. And Schelling thinks that this is a question and problem that his contemporaries were worried about. Fichte, Hegel, and even early German romantics like Schlegel, I think, are all worried about this question. Why is there something and not nothing? Now, the positive philosophy is grappling with this question. So we have a problem. Why is there something? And then we have a philosophy that is built to grapple with this problem, that is designed at least to attempt to answer it. And there is a way in which the positive philosophy does indeed answer this question. Why is there something? And what's the answer? Well, it's quite simple. God. God is the reason why there is something. Okay, so you have it. That's the positive philosophy. Okay, so everything else is just an elucidation of this. Okay, we can all go home. No, okay, so what is the task of the positive philosophy? Let us call the philosophy that comprehends the actual God, and thus in general, not simply the possibility, but the actuality of things, the positive philosophy. So the positive philosophy comprehends the actual God and the actuality of things. That's what it does. And these will go together. So the actuality of things and the actuality of God go hand in hand. We only understand the actuality of things because somehow they're grounded in the actuality of God. Okay. Now, if this is the case, ultimately, Schelling needs to give an argument for the existence of God, why God is. And this forms, one could say, a centerpiece of the positive philosophy. Since positive philosophy is comprehending God as the reason for being, he needs to give a reason for holding this view. And I'm going to go ahead and read the key passage here from the text where Schelling gives the argument. He says, quote, if that which necessarily exists is God, then this and that consequence, we want to say, then A, B, and C, and so on become possible. But if according to our experience, A, B, C, and so on really exist, then the necessary conclusion is that that which necessarily exists is really God. Okay, so this is a mouthful and difficult to follow, especially if you haven't been grappling with the text carefully, or you haven't been kind of working through Schelling's philosophy and using his, and if you're not familiar with his terminology. One can simplify the argument to say something like this, and we'll fill in the details, come back to this terminology later on. One can simplify the argument by saying something like this. If God exists, then the world is going to be possible. The possibility of the world is one of these consequences. And one can even say, if God exists, then the determinacy of entities in the world become possible. However, we know that the world is, and that these determinate entities in the world itself is possible, and thus God exists. The argument seems to have the form of a logical fallacy. So it seems to go like, if A, then B, B, then A. It seems to be affirming the consequent. So the problem, as Edward Beach points out, is that the positive philosophy itself seems to be grounded in a logical fallacy. And so the knowledge of the actual God that constitutes positive philosophy is endangered. And the validity and the soundness of positive philosophy is called into question. So let me read what Beach says. More critically still is the fact, and Beach has this wonderful book, The Potencies of Gods. It's on Schelling's philosophy of mythology. More critical still is the fact that Schelling's conclusion does not seem to follow logically in any case. On the face of it, he appears to have committed the fallacy of affirming the consequent. Granting that A, B, and C, the consequent might be true, and in my reconstruction, this includes the existence of the world. In principle, there could be other possible causes leading to the same result, that is, other causes other than God. Hence, the desired conclusion, the antecedent that God exists, would not be deducible on these grounds alone. Could it be that the philosopher has unwittingly fallen into so elementary a fallacy? Now, maybe some Hegelians would like that, but I don't want to simply rush right there. I want to make an effort to be as charitable as I can. And I think that if you look at the literature, I've discovered a couple different interpretations of the argument that try to save the argument from being a logical fallacy or simply an invalid argument. One is by Bruce Matthews. He's also the translator of the text that I'm using, The Grounding of Positive Philosophy, and also Fred Rush, whose article shows up in the Cambridge Companion, I believe. Now, Bruce Matthews says, rather than read Schelling's argument for the existence of God as a deductive argument, it's better to read it as a kind of abductive argument on the model of Peirce's understanding of abduction. And you'll see also that Rush says something similar, that we should read Schelling's argument as an argument to the best explanation. And so the basic idea that Matthews has is to say, look, for Schelling, the existence of the world is a surprising fact. Now, we're going to have to talk about why this is supposed to be surprising. And I do want to motivate the surprising nature of the existence of the world, but we're going to have to wait on this. In any case, the idea is that the existence of the world is a surprising fact. And Matthew reads the argument like this, that, well, look, if we posit God as a hypothesis, we can explain the world. And this speaks in favor of the existence of God. And so we have reason to hold that God exists. We have reason to hold that God exists. However, there could be other reasons for why the world exists other than God, right? So as Matthew says, the conclusion always remains problematic. And there are alternative explanations for why or how the predicated events came to be. And because, according to Matthews, if we reread the argument as an abductive argument, or something like an argument to the best explanation, then we can avoid this charge of invalidity. And two, what it does is it opens up Schelling's philosophizing to a whole host of possibilities that have been traditionally closed off. So what Matthew says is, he says, far from being one method that all must follow in doing this, Schelling argues for an almost anarchic approach in which each individual must for themselves create their own account of the inner meaning of existence, while nonetheless remaining fully aware of the fact that these meanings could be in error. Now, I am a little bit suspicious of this approach, in part because Schelling himself, if we go back to the argument, seems to say that the conclusion is necessary. The necessary conclusion is that that which necessarily exists is God. So it's not a problematic conclusion or a possible way of thinking, but it's a necessary one. And in fact, we'll find that, that Schelling will talk about the future of thinking in a very specific way. And I'll kind of scroll down to the end, where Schelling will say that the positive philosophy, this is the bold on the bottom of page 5, opens onto a future that will be nothing other than the progressive proof of the existence of the power that rules over being. That is God. God is the power that rules over being, the Lord of being. So what Schelling has said is the future is nothing other than this progressive proof of God's existence. So the future is not the progressive proof of alternative hypotheses, of all, alternative hypotheses that could explain the world. The future has one form, the progressive proof of God. So we have good, and also it's not clear that we should understand God's existence as hypothesis, when in fact, Schelling doesn't speak of it like this. It's not a mere hypothesis. And this is what brings me to another reading, which I will be trying to fill out throughout the rest of the talk. Edward Allen Beach in this Potencies of Gods offers a different way of thinking about the argument. In order to comprehend the convoluted line of reasoning, this is coming from a Schelling scholar here, it is necessary to import an unstated premise that may be reasonably imputed to the negative philosophy. Only if, not just if, but only if the necessary existing being is God, would A, B, C be possible. Although Schelling does not explicitly make this presupposition, it is clearly implied by the context. Starting from this presupposition, a valid argument can be reconstructed. Schelling clearly believes that by following the causal order step by step in his dialectic, he has established a series of if and only if connections. The concept of Das Seiende as the blueprint of the world has far more than the status of an ordinary inductive hypothesis. And that would also apply to an abductive one. It is rather understood to be the sole theoretical framework that could serve to explain all entities and states of affairs considered as pure possibilities. So one way to revise the argument, or rather than talk about it as a revision, another way to read it is to uncover an implicit premise, which is very common in philosophy. And this is the implicit premise that if God did not exist, then the world would be impossible. Namely, this is saying that only on the condition that God exists can the world exist. Only on the condition that God exists can there be a world. And so what I'd like to do is I would like to give an interpretation of this argument, to read this argument for God's existence with this suggested revision in mind. Beach himself doesn't actually work it out in detail because he's focused on the philosophy of mythology. So he's just trying to show that the positive philosophy does not rest on a mere logical error. And then he goes on. But I'd like to fill out this reading in more detail. Okay, this is going to take a little bit of work, but my hope is that I can do it in the next 45 minutes. Okay. So the negative philosophy. What is the negative philosophy? Well, what we want to do in the positive philosophy is we want to answer this question: why is there something? Why is there any being at all? So in order to do that, we have to think about what it is to be a being. Each being instantiates being. So in order to understand this question, and in order to understand the kind of answer that can be given to this question, we need to think about what it is to be. And this is what the negative philosophy does. The negative philosophy is a practice in conceptual analysis. It analyzes concepts, and in particular, it analyzes the concept of being, that which every being instantiates. Now, why call this negative? Why call this negative? Somehow, this conceptual work requires negation. So I'll read this passage. With this is then also provided the concept of a negative science, whose duty is precisely this: to produce in this manner the concept of what being itself is, through the successive elimination of everything that is not being and that lies implicit or potential in the general and indeterminate concept of being. The science can lead not further than to the aforementioned negative concept, thus in general only to the concept of being itself. So the negative philosophy produces a concept. It, through analysis, arrives at knowledge of what it is to be, the concept of being. This is negative because what one must do in order to achieve this is to negate everything that is contingently related to being as such, to what it is to be, right? And so he says, in this science, everything that is contingent is removed, right? So through the process of analysis, what we do is we think, what is essential to being qua being? Being is not necessarily a rock or a stone or a wall or time or space. We can negate all of these contingent features that are related to being in order to think what is essential to being qua being. So that's what the negative philosophy does. And as a result, we arrive at what he'll call the infinite capacity to be, das unendliche Sein können. And he calls this immediate Prius, the immediate concept of being itself. We can understand this as a können, as a kind of possibility. Concepts for Schelling are possibilities, ways of being. The concept of being seems to be unending because the concept of being is instantiated by all beings. And so there doesn't seem to be any beings beyond it, right? There doesn't seem to be any beings that do not instantiate it. So it seems to be infinite or all-encompassing. Okay, and the negative philosophy then is going to arrive at this concept. Okay, so the question of negative philosophy, the question that negative philosophy asks is precisely, what is that being that is the immediate content of reason? What belongs to it such that it is being? What belongs to being such that it is being? Now, and then the negative philosophy will answer that question. And the answer to that question is the knowledge that negative philosophy acquires. Okay. Now, the very last quote here, the second quote on this page, the science that accomplishes this elimination of what is contingent in the first concept of being, and with this frees being itself, frees it from what is contingently related to it, is critical, is of the negative type, and possesses in its result what we have called being itself, das Sein des Selbst, yet still only in thought, because this is a concept. Now, there's a very difficult passage here that I want to gloss. I don't want to get lost in it because I think this will detract us from our end here, but we can go into more detail later if people are interested. What do we know about being? Well, the negative philosophy asks, what is the being of being? So the answer will be being is such and such. And whatever we say however we answer the question, we have to predicate something of being. We know being is universal. It's a concept. It's what all concepts instantiate it, right? All concepts are. And it seems that all beings are somehow going to instantiate it. We know being is universal, right? But when I say being is such and such, when I say what being is, I'm going to give a predicate. I'm going to differentiate being from what being is not. I'm going to differentiate the concept of being from other concepts, such as quality, quantity, relation, whatever other concepts there may be. The predicate, right, will distinguish and differentiate being from other things. And it will thereby make it determinate. So when we predicate something of the subject, we're determining it. And as something that's determined, it stands in this negative relationship to what it's not. So Schelling is also operating with this idea that determination involves negation. So when I say what being is in the negative philosophy, being is such and such, I'm differentiating it and determining it from other categories, from other things, and thereby making it into a thing, making it into a particular concept that's different from others. And so Schelling will say it's not only the subject of the judgment, being is, but in fact, we're differentiating it, we're turning it into a particular thing. And so he also calls it an object. It is an object, right? Being is also an object. Being is a thing. The thing that makes being what it is specified by the predicate that we say of it. So ultimately, being is a being. Being is a being because the negative philosophy answers the question, what is being, by giving a predicate, and thereby determining and differentiating it. Now, someone may say, but wait, that's ontotheology. We thought that's not supposed to be true. But it's not easy to just say it's ontotheology, so it's false. The reason it's not easy is that if you withdraw the predicate from being, and you say being is, but you don't predicate anything of being, then you find yourself in an additional problem, right? Because now being has no determinacy, and it has no predicate, but the predicate says the what it is to be of something. It says the being of something. So by withdrawing the predicate from being, you're also withdrawing being from being, right? Which is a problem, because being is that which is. You can't withdraw being from it. And that's what you do if you fail to predicate something. So Schelling seems to think that when we think what is being, being has some being. It is a being. And that's the result of the negative philosophy. Now, ultimately, this insight that being is a being can be analyzed into three different, what Schelling will call potencies. Sometimes he'll talk about them as subject matters. We have the universal, the particular, and the unity of both of them. Being is a universal, it's a particular universal, and it's both universal and particular. But for the sake of shorthand and simplification, what we need to carry with us is the insight that negative philosophy, in analyzing the concept of being, negates everything contingently related to it, and thereby arrives at the insight that to be is to be something. To be is to be a being. That's what it knows. Now, does negative philosophy really achieve what philosophy is after? Is negative philosophy complete? Now, when I ask that question, you might wonder, well, what is philosophy after? Well, according to Schelling, philosophy is after the unconditioned. It wants unconditioned knowledge. When we ask, why is there something? What we're after is unconditioned knowledge. We want that upon which all things depend. Not that upon which some things depend, but that upon which all things depend. So philosophy is after the unconditioned condition of everything. Does negative philosophy really arrive at unconditioned knowledge? And Schelling will say no. And it does not arrive at unconditioned knowledge because no concept gives us unconditioned knowledge. Concepts, according to Schelling, are not sufficient to account for their own existence. Concepts are not self-realizing, they're not self-particularizing, they're not self-instantiating beings. If I want to know whether a concept exists or not, I have to go outside the concept, Schelling says. So because I have a concept of human being, it doesn't mean that human beings exist. Because I have a concept of God, it does not mean that God exists. The concept of something, right? Just because I have the concept of something, it doesn't mean that it exists. So the idea is the principle in virtue of which a concept exists comes from outside the concept itself. And so the existence of the concept, right, is something that the concept can't account for, right? So the concept is conditioned by something outside of it, this principle of existence that it depends upon for its realization, right? So concepts depend upon something else for their realization. They're not unconditioned. And so negative philosophy never gives us unconditioned knowledge. It only gets us conditioned knowledge. Now, this argument that negative philosophy only gets us conditioned knowledge, right, because they depend on a principle of existence beyond themselves, depends on a distinction between concept and existence that Schelling seems to be thinking out of from Kant. So I want to talk about this distinction briefly, and it's a very important distinction because it brings us to the positive philosophy and it informs Schelling's critique of Hegel. So it does a lot of work, so we should look at the text here. Schelling says, here we should note in everything that is real, there are two things to be known. It is entirely two different things, or it is entirely different things to know what a being is and that it is. The former, the answer to the question what it is, accords me insight into the essence of the thing, or it provides that I understand the thing, that I have an understanding or a concept of it, or have it itself within the concept. The other insight, however, that it is, does not accord me just the concept, but rather something that goes beyond just the concept, which is existence. So I have the sein, or the being of something that's stated through the concept, and then I have existence, the existence which goes beyond the concept. That something exists at all, and particularly that this determinate thing exists in the world, can never be realized a priori and claimed by reason without experience. Right? So whether I want to know whether a concept exists, I have to go, again, beyond the concept. And so according to Schelling, we need a philosophy other than the negative, because the negative doesn't give us the unconditioned, and that's what we want. We want the unconditioned ground of all beings. And the negative only gets us conditioned knowledge of concepts earned through analysis, right? So analysis takes you so far, and then, but it doesn't take you all the way. So he says, I have led you to the point where philosophy, as far as it now seeks its final and highest object, brings itself only so far as a logically mediated concept in thought, is incapable of demonstrating it in its own existence. In its culmination, the negative philosophy itself contains the demand for the positive, right? The negative philosophy wants to know whether its concept of being exists. It wants to know whether the concept of being, which is the same as being something, in fact is instantiated, whether it exists. And the philosophy that is aware of itself and understands itself completely certainly has the need to posit the positive outside of itself. So a philosopher engaged in negative philosophy who's aware of the limits of their activity is going to realize that they need to engage in a different kind of philosophizing. They need to supplement their thinking with a new kind of thinking. Now, the important kind of connection to contingency here in the title of my talk you can also see in this quote here. Schelling says the fact that it exists, concept, is something purely contingent. The circumstance of whether it exists or not does not change my concept of the content in the least. This seems to again be coming from Kant here, that if I have a concept and I want to know whether it obtains in the world, Schelling seems to have this ancient Greek idea in mind that the concept can only correspond with the being if the being itself has conceptual structure. Only if the being itself has conceptual structure can the concept really correspond with the thing. Now, how is that going to work? Well, that's only going to work according to Schelling if existence itself is not going to be a predicate. Because if existence itself were a predicate, then the concept insofar as it exists would have different conceptual content and more conceptual content than the concept that is merely thought. And so you wouldn't have a correspondence of concept and being if we thought of existence as being a predicate. Existence has to transcend conceptuality in order for there to be truth, in order for there to be a match between concept and being. Now, this idea that that argument really one can find in Kant already, but Schelling is appealing to this and drawing upon this distinction in order to make the claim that we need something other than concepts in order to discover the existence of those concepts. Concepts are not sufficient for their own existence. Okay, now Simple point, in a way, quite a traditional point. Okay, so it's not a radical idea. However, he thinks this is, once he has this in place, he's shown the limit of negative philosophy, and now he can stand in a critical relation to his earlier work and to Hegel. Okay, so he can stand in a critical relation to Hegel because he thinks Hegel is merely a negative philosopher, but that Hegel thinks that he's also a positive one. The positive philosopher is the one who will be able to determine the existence of the concepts. But according to Schelling, the big mistake Hegel made is he wants concepts to be sufficient principles of their own existence. So Schelling thinks that Hegel views the Begriff as self-particularizing, as self-determining, as self-realizing concept. So if the concept in Hegel is a self-instantiating concept, if that's the power of the concept, then according to Schelling, Hegel's concept is both negative and positive. Hegel's concept is a concept that is sufficient for its own realization, and you don't need kind of two stems, concept and then a different independent principle of existence. I won't read these two quotes where Schelling critiques Hegel, but you can look at them. And in particular, he's highly critical of the transition from logic to nature. So he thinks that somehow Hegel thinks that logic per se can produce natural entities. So this is how he reads Hegel. And he thinks that's not right. From the logic of the concept, we can't deduce the existence of natural entities that would instantiate logical categories. So we can talk about whether Schelling read Hegel correctly or not later, but just to get a sense of how Schelling is understanding himself in relation to Hegel. Now, is there a good reason to read Hegel like this? Well, there are passages where Hegel does talk this way. So if you look here, Hegel says the derivation of the real from the concept, if derivation is what you want to call it, consists at first in this, that the concept in its formal abstraction reveals itself to be incomplete, and through a dialectic immanently grounded in it, passes over into reality. It passes over into it, reality, however, as into something which it generates out of itself, not as if it were falling back again onto a ready-made reality, which it finds opposite it. So Schelling, is, I think, trying to read Hegel carefully and takes Hegel to really think that concepts are sufficient principles of their own existence. And so he thinks Hegel has violated this difference between negative and positive. Now, interestingly, Schelling says that Hegel perfected an error that Schelling himself had committed. So if we look at the bottom of page 3 here, he says, thus, if the error of the first presentation was not to have placed what is positive outside itself, so this was surpassed by the ensuing Hegelian presentation, but only throughout the perfection of that error. So Schelling seems to think that his earlier identity philosophy, the presentation of my system of philosophy, the error of the first presentation, actually thinks of everything as, thinks about everything in terms of the negative, doesn't make this distinction between the negative and the positive, and treats reason as this all-encompassing self-sufficient totality. And that's the mistake of the identity philosophy, which then he says Hegel perfected. So Hegel, he says, is influenced by him and takes this error and perfects the mistake, which is a backhanded comment. It's like, it's a mistake and you just made the mistake worse. You took the mistake as the principle of the system. So Schelling's mature philosophy, I think it's hard to say Schelling had the exact same idea, the whole is over. He's, as Hegel would say, performing the education in public. However, his late philosophy is an attempt to further refine and differentiate the difference between negative and positive, and to become clearer and clearer on this distinction, which he himself had overlooked and had not fully appreciated in his earlier thought, and that he thinks Hegel himself overlooks and oversteps. Okay. So this is a little bit on how the Schelling's late philosophy is at least a divergence from the identity philosophy and how Schelling understands himself contra Hegel, even if in fact are closer than he would like us to think. Okay. They at least share, as I said, a problem in common. Why is there something? Which I think is also a problem that Hegel has as well. All right, so what's the positive philosophy? We want to have unconditioned knowledge. We want to know why there is something, and the negative philosophy doesn't give us that. All it tells us is the content of the concept of being, that to be is to be something, but the principle of existence in virtue of which the concept of something exists has to come from beyond or outside of the concept itself. So what is the principle of existence for the concept of being? What does Schelling say? If it does not start out from something that occurs in thought, and thus in no way from pure thought, then it will start out from that which is before and external to all thought. So the positive philosophy starts out from that which is external to all thought, that which is beyond all thought. Why is that? Why is the principle in virtue of which the concept of being exists going to be beyond all thought? Schelling will also tell us that it's actually the principle in virtue of which the concept of being exists will also be beyond every determinate being. Look at the next quote. If positive philosophy starts out from that which is external to all thought, it cannot begin with a being that is external to thought in a relative sense, but only with a being that is absolutely external to thought. The being that is external to all thought, however, is just as much beyond all experience as it is before all thought. Positive philosophy begins with a completely transcendent being and can no longer be a merely relative Prius or relative beginning. So it's beyond all experience, it's beyond all thought. Why is that? Well, the first point is that the concept of being, which we know is to be something, is the most universal concept, and all concepts instantiate it. So if the principle in virtue of which the concept of being exists must come from beyond the concept of being, that means the principle in virtue of which the concept of being exists must come from beyond all concepts. It cannot itself, the principle of existence, in virtue of which the concept of being exists, cannot be conceptual. It must be trans-conceptual or non-conceptual or some way of articulating this. That's the first point. But the second point is that actually this concept of being, which as we said, to be is to be something, is instantiated, according to Schelling, in, it seems, all experience, and it's instantiated in all determinate beings, right? So every determinate being instantiates the concept of being and being determinate. So if I want to find the principle in virtue of which determinate being exists, and I have to go beyond the concept of that being to find that principle, this means that I would have to go beyond not only the concept of determinate being, but beyond every single being, because every single being instantiates that concept. And that means that the principle in virtue of which determinate being exists cannot itself be determinate. It must be, but be devoid of all whatness. It must be, but be devoid of all determinacy. It simply must be without further qualification. In other words, that in virtue of which being exists must ultimately, that in virtue of which being determinate, this concept of determinate being exists, must be that which is, but without further qualification. Now, what is that? That looks very close to Hegel's Sein, okay? Hegel's Sein, full stop, okay? The first category of the science, it looks like this. I say looks like because, again, this is supposed to be beyond thought, okay? Not a first category in a logic, okay? But this is what Schelling says here. Rather, I must do away with precisely this concept, the concept of God. Indeed, we have to get rid of all the concepts to give an account of the origin of concepts in order to proceed from that which just exists. So we're not going to proceed from God because God is a determinate concept. We're going to begin from just that which exists, dem bloßen Existierende, in which nothing at all is thought other than just that which just exists. Existence, full stop, to see whether the divine can be reached from it. So we're just starting here. We're not finishing here. But I read this just to point out that I'm not making everything up here, but this is actually what Schelling thinks. We're going to start from what is devoid of all determinacy and all conceptuality. The next sentence also shows this. As I said, it lets go, it's the positive philosophy, of the concept and retains only that which purely is, devoid of all whatness. That which only exists is precisely that which crushes everything. This is very intense language. That may derive from thought, before which thought becomes silent and before which reason itself bows down. Okay. My religious sensibilities are heightened here when I read things like this. Okay, but let me try to keep my head about me, okay, and try to give the argument here. Okay. Now, all well and good. However, one might worry. How is it that the completely indeterminate, that which exists without any whatness, beyond any concept, how could that be the source of determinate being? How could that be the principle and virtue of which determinate being exists? Because if I begin with what has no differentiations and no distinctions, simply that which purely is without qualification, nothing differentiated or distinct follows from that. I can't deduce out of pure existence any particular existing thing. I can't read out of indeterminacy any determinacy. And rather, it does seem as though if it is the case that the existence of determinate entities depends upon something radically indeterminate, then there will in principle be no determinacy at all. There should in principle not only not be anything determinate, but in fact, nothing determinate should be possible, because it seems impossible for the determinate to come from the indeterminate. If the indeterminate is the principle of existence for the determinate, it seems like the determinate should not be at all. And that in fact, only the indeterminate should be able to be. Not even this, because the indeterminate is not determinate. So not even the indeterminate can be. Neither the determinate nor the indeterminate should be able to be, if this is the case. So in fact, the positive philosophy begins with the recognition that determinacy must depend upon the indeterminate. But this seems to make the possibility of determinacy and its existence totally disappear. So this is a big problem. How can the world even exist? And this is, again, why I think you go back to that first quote. The problem of the existence of the world is a problem. It's a real problem. Okay. Now, Schelling is surprised by the fact that the world exists. Why would somebody be surprised at the fact that the world exists? Well, because they've been thinking hard. They've been thinking hard. So he's been thinking hard. And he's surprised by the world's existence. In fact, Schelling encounters a world full of differentiation, full of determination, A, B, and C, determinate entities in relation to each other, a world amenable to knowing, a world that is scientifically knowable in the German sense of Wissenschaft, okay? It's a world amenable to concepts. This is a world that he discovers. He experiences this. Now, this is radically surprising because the world shouldn't exist. The world shouldn't exist, right? The world shouldn't exist, as Schelling has said, because the principle and virtue of which the determinate exists is something radically indeterminate. And out of the indeterminate, you're not going to get the determinate. And so Schelling is surprised about the world's existence. It is an astonishing fact that there is a world. And if the world exists as a determinate totality, then of course the world must be possible as a determinate totality. And so Schelling wants to ask, well, what is the condition that would enable, that would make possible, let's put this in Kantian terms, what is the condition that would make possible the determinacy of the world? Well, we know that if the source of a world were radically indeterminate, the determinate world would be impossible. So the only way in which the determinacy of the world would be possible, the only way in which the existence of the world would be possible, is if the source of determinate being were itself determinate. That means that if you remember back, what is the source of being? That which just exists. Or in the argument for God's existence, Schelling expresses this as that which necessarily exists. Existence itself. Existence itself must be a determinate thing. The source of determinate being must itself be a determinate being. Otherwise, the determinacy of the world would be impossible. So what Schelling is arguing here is that, look, it is a surprising fact that the world exists, and we know that there is a world through experience. And so we also know that the world is possible because it is. But what's the condition of the possibility of a determinate world? only a source that itself is determinate, because an indeterminate source itself seems to be one which would abolish the possibility of a determinate world. Another way of thinking about this is like the following. If you think about the world as a determinate totality, and you say that the source of that world is merely indeterminate, then according to Schelling, that would mean that the world itself would not have a limit, and there would be nothing other than the world. And so the world itself couldn't be determinate. And for Schelling, determinacy again is involved with negation. The world itself can only be determinate if it's negatively related to that which is other than it. And the only thing that is other than it is its source, that indeterminate source. So the only way in which the world itself can be determinate, which we do encounter this determinate world and experience, is if the indeterminate source of the world itself were determinate. Now, what does that have to do with God? Well, the idea is that the idea of God is this idea of a being whose essence is to exist. It is existence, right, understood as a being. That's what the idea of God is. And so according to Schelling, it's only under this condition in which that which exists is God that the world as a determinate totality can be possible. So I think if we read the text carefully, we actually come to see that for Schelling, the determinacy of the world would not be possible unless the source of that world, right, that which simply exists, were itself a determinate being, that is, itself were God. Otherwise, the determinacy of the world would not be possible. And so this is why Casper, I think, rightly says, when Schelling speaks of a Prius of the divinity, this is of course not to be understood in a chronological, but a purely logical sense. So we have this sense that, of course, the God is, in a logical sense, a condition that enables the determinacy of the world to be possible. Existence itself must be determined to be God if the world itself is going to be determinate. So there are some passages where this is exactly what Schelling says. He says, if before he is divine, he is that which is, then for this very reason, he is that which proceeds as concept and thus all concepts. In the positive philosophy, I do not proceed from the concept of God as the ontological argument and the former metaphysics attempted to do. But if positive philosophy does not start out from experience, nothing prevents it from going towards experience and thereby proving a posteriori what it has to prove, that its Prius is God, that is, that which is above being, thus Überseiende. So again, God is the principle of existence, of determinate being, existence itself posited as a being. So it is the being that's beyond being, the Überseiende, or what in Pseudo-Dionysus is called Hyperousia, the ousia who is an Hyperousia, the being that is beyond being. So again, Schelling wants to make himself clear, even if it's difficult, not the absolute Prius itself will be proved, but rather what the consequences are that follow from this. These must be factually proved, and only thereby do we prove the divinity of that Prius, that it is God and that God therefore exists. Right? So what we are not proving in the positive philosophy that we're not proving existence itself. What the positive philosophy wants to prove is that existence is God, and that there is this being called God. So just to review very briefly the argument that Schelling wants to give. The idea is that the determinacy of the world would only be possible if the source of the existence of the world were determinate. Only if that which exists is God is the determinacy of the world possible. And is the world itself possible as a determinate totality. We do in fact experience the world. We experience determinate beings in the world. And so the world certainly is possible. And the only way, as he says, that can be is if existence is God. And so we know that there is this being, God, whose very essence is just to exist. That's the idea that Schelling has. That's the direction of reasoning that he's engaged in. And this is also why I've tried to make the argument that ultimately this argument for God's existence is not is not supposed to be a problematic conclusion. It is based on a contingent premise. The contingent premise is that we find a world. But given the premises themselves, Schelling wants to argue, or at least he intends to argue, that God must be. Otherwise, the world wouldn't exist as a determinate totality. Okay, now, just a brief word about the unity of the positive, I should say, and the negative. Unity of the positive and the negative here. You might think that the negative is one kind of philosophy, the positive is another, and they're somehow different from each other. But rather, they're actually two parts of the same whole. So Schelling says it has become apparent that the negative philosophy must posit the positive, but by positing this, it only makes itself into the consciousness of the positive, and is to this extent no longer outside the positive, but rather belongs to it itself. So there is in fact but one philosophy. So it looks as though throughout the whole that negative is other than positive, and they're two distinct philosophies that somehow come together. And then you might ask, well, how are they unified? But rather here, Schelling wants to say there's one philosophy, it's the positive. And so you can see how the negative and positive form two sides of the same thing. The negative is the consciousness of the positive, this awareness that we needed, and that belongs to the positive itself. And then there's the execution of that demand. So there's the consciousness of the Aufgabe, and then the execution of the Aufgabe. And that's what a positive philosophy consists in: the consciousness of the demand and the fulfillment of the demand. Right? And so then we have these two sides. Even this argument for God's existence has these two sides. We have this, one could say, logical cognition of the relation of concepts. This concept of the determinate world is possible only on the condition that its source, the source of its existence in itself, is a determinate being, that is God. But is there a world? We only know that through experience, right? There is a world, and we know that through experience, right? And these two together are combined in order to draw the conclusion that existence itself must be God. Now, Schelling, sometimes it depends on the text that you read. It looks like he's very close to mysticism, and Schelling does have a soft spot for mysticism. He does respect it. He says that even in the 1840s, mystical empiricism had not really been overcome. But he thinks that his positive philosophy can overcome it. He does draw upon mystical thinkers like Boehme. Boehme has this concept of the Ungrund, the non-ground or the unground, which we have all the way back in the Freedom Essay. And this unground now has been rethought as existence itself, or as that which exists without further qualification. So you have that continuity, right, from the Freedom Essay from Boehme. However, he rejects Boehme's method and mystical method in general, because he says what the mystics do is they start out from experience, from something that occurs in experience. But Schelling does not. Schelling begins from, sometimes we'll call the unprethinkable or the Ungrund. He begins from existence as such, and then determines that to be God. So he begins from the indeterminate and then arrives at the determinate through this mediated process of reasoning and experience. And so this is what Tillich says. Tillich says, with the formula God is Lord, Schelling bases his protest against mysticism on the ground of the positive philosophy. So it's not to be confused with mysticism. Neither the theosophical mysticism of Boehme, nor the mysticism or early mysticism of Jacobi, where we know about God through an external sign or an internal feeling. Rather, we know about God through this argument that Schelling has given us, right? So that has the negative and positive components to it. So the positive philosophy is going from the non-conceptual to the conceptual. It's actually conceptualizing something that transcends concepts. It's conceptualizing the non-conceptual ground of conceptuality. It's determining the indeterminate ground of determinacy. And that's how he talks about it. He says, it posits non-conceptual being in order to reach from it to the concept, right? We must begin from being devoid of the concept, right? But then what do? He says the positive philosophy concerns itself with this only in order to transform precisely that which is incomprehensible a priori into that which is a posteriori comprehensible. What is incomprehensible a priori becomes comprehensible in God. So this is what he calls this metaphysical empiricism, right? We are ultimately showing that existence must be God, but we're, so this is a kind of super sensible knowledge. It's a knowledge about something that, of some super sensible entity, but we need an empirical premise, this experience of the world, to get us there. So this is why he says there's something right about empiricism, but it's wrong if it denies super sensible knowledge. And there's something right about mysticism, they have God, but they go about it the wrong way. Now, before I talk about the paradox here, I'll just note that Schelling seems to think that the determinacy, and look at this last quote on page 4, the determinacy of pure existence, the determinacy of the principle of existence, that is God, that makes the determinacy of the world possible, according to Schelling, is indirectly posited by God himself. Schelling thinks we're never going to read out determinacy out of indeterminacy. He thinks that's what Hegel tries to do in the science of logic. Through a dialectical development, Sein becomes Dasein. But according to Schelling, you can never go from Sein to Dasein dialectically. That's not possible. Rather, Dasein is posited, the determinacy of being is posited without why. We don't know why it's there, but it is there. This is the surprising fact of the determinacy of the world. And so this is why Schelling says that God creates the world contingently. It's a contingent act of freedom or spontaneity. And so God's, one could say, distinction from the world comes about indirectly. God, by positing an independent world, separates himself from the world and then is other than the world which he's posited. This kind of, this is really close to a dialectic of reflection that you'll see in the second part of Hegel's Science of Logic. And it really seems to be a kind of reasoning that you'll find in Schelling all the way back to the Freedom Essay, where he talks about this dialectic of ground and grounded is operative. And you see elements of that here too. I won't talk about it too much. I just wanted to point out that for Schelling, we're not going to read the determinacy of the world out of the indeterminate origin. It is posited spontaneously without why. And the determinacy of God is indirectly posited as that which contrasts with the world that God has produced. Now, let's talk about the elephant in the room, which is the paradox that this philosophy seems to fall into. Okay, so it seems to fall into contradiction because what we're doing is we're conceptualizing the transconceptual. And Schelling will call it the inverted idea, the idea in which reason is set outside itself. Okay. So it seems that what we're trying to do is we're trying to grasp the principle of existence in virtue of which determinate being is. And this needs to be indeterminate existence. However, if it remains indeterminate, then determinate being disappears. So the only way for determinate being to be is if the indeterminate origin of determinacy is determinate. But if it is determinate, then actually what we're doing is we have a contradiction. We've made the indeterminate determinate, or we've made the transconceptual conceptual. And then the transconceptual is both transconceptual and conceptual. It's both indeterminate and determinate. It's both devoid of whatness and it has whatness. You get the point. However, Schelling recognizes that problem. It's not that he doesn't see it, and he builds it into the whole theory. And this is why he says that positive philosophy is incomplete and is only a love of wisdom. He says the proof is therefore never finished. The bold is all my emphasis here. And for this reason, this science is only a philosophy. And he says, in this context, even the present is no limit, but is here a view that still opens onto a future that will also be nothing other than the progressive proof of the existence of the power that rules over being, Herr des Seins, Lord of Being. So why does it mean that, why does this paradox entail that the proof is never done? It's a proof that goes on forever. It's an interesting proof, right? Proof that never finishes. You might wonder, is that really a proof then, if it never finishes? Okay, so that's another question we need to ask ourselves here. What kind of argument? Was one never-ending argument? What does it look like? But I think the reason that Schelling sees this is you can see it as a kind of third man regress. If you've read the Parmenides, then you're well prepared for this, which is that the ground of determinacy is indeterminate, but the determinate world can only be determinate if the indeterminate ground of determinacy itself is determinate. But then we have a relationship of the determinate ground to the determinate grounded. And then we have a greater sphere or domain of determinacy. And we know that the principle of existence in virtue of which the determinate exists must come from beyond every determinate being. So if we think of existence itself as God, as a determinate being, then ultimately the principle of existence must come from beyond God. It must come from beyond God as a determinate being. And we need to posit a God that's beyond God. The Gottheit, or a God beyond God. This is how Eckhart will talk, God beyond God. So there must be a God beyond God that makes God possible. But if this is indeterminate existence, and it lies at the origin of the determinate world, the only way the determinate world will be possible is if the indeterminate origin is made determinate. And so then the God beyond God must also be a determinate being and must be a part of the determinate world. And therefore, we need a principle of existence that would explain that in virtue of which even the God beyond God exists. And it goes on infinitely like this. Every time we try to grasp the origin of determinate being, we make it into a determinate being, and then it belongs, it's immanent in the world, and therefore it can't explain the world. And therefore we need to posit another determinate being lying at the ground. And it goes on infinitely and never ends. So what's the incompleteness? I think this is also in a way what Matthews is trying to get at here. What's the origin of the incompleteness? It's not that there are a variety of different hypotheses that are possible. Our individuality kind of is constituted by which one that we opt for. It's actually that there's an incompleteness built into the system because the cognition or the conceptualization of the existence as God leads to paradox and contradiction, such that we are in an infinite regress. We're in an infinite regress that ultimately never ends. At least this is how I'm reading this. Now, this is I'm going over a little bit here. So one final question that we could ask here is whether Schelling was not once again unfaithful to himself here, and whether, after all, he did not take seriously and radically enough the impossibility of thinking and the impossibility of having a precedent in thought. I want to come back to this final question in just a minute. But before I do, I just wanted to say something about myth and revelation, because I'm going to be thinking about this a bit more and writing about this a little bit more. We can not only look toward the future, but also look towards the past. And we can think about the way in which existence is revealed as divine by thinking about human history. And that existence is revealed as divine in mythology, where existence is revealed in a polytheistic way, and there's all these stages of this revelation, right? That has its origin in unconscious nature and all the like. We also have the revelation of existence as God in monotheism and Christianity, where the God that transcends being is made incarnate. And so we have this existence determined as divine, here as flesh and blood, as we celebrate it at Christmas, right? And then we have the philosophical consciousness, the kind of conceptual revelation of existence as God in philosophy. And so we have this progressive revelation of existence as God, which indefinitely goes on into the future. One of the questions which we might kind of take up the atheist here as a kind of conversation partner, and then ask, doesn't this infinite regress or just show that there's no God? And doesn't it mean that just God doesn't exist and we shouldn't posit existence as God? So that's one way to go. But I think for Schelling, the worry then is that we lose the determinacy of the world and therefore the possibility of science. We lose the amenability of the world to concepts. And if existence isn't determined as God, then in fact, scientism is impossible. So just like one may make the argument that without God, all things are permitted, kind of a Dostoevskian reflection. Here we could say if God doesn't exist, then science itself doesn't seem to be possible. But you still might push and then ask, well, how exactly, if every determination of existence as God leads to contradiction, how in principle can we say with conviction that in fact the positive philosophy comprehends the actual God as the reason why there's something? One way of doing it, and I'm not certain that this is Schelling's, but it is Schellingian in spirit, I think, is to consider that every time one tries to complete the process and finish it, one fails to finish it. And so every time one tries to close the system, right, and close the system and say, finally, we have existence as God, full stop, the proof is finished, then the existence itself or the divine somehow transcends what I'm knowing. Existence itself transcends what I've said, and it exceeds and breaks out of what I'm thinking. And so somebody could argue that actually the otherness of God is actually recognized or revealed through the failure to actually ever fully encompass existence in a determinate conceptual articulation. And this is the free thinking that philosophy is engaged in positive philosophy, is the recognition of the transcendence and otherness of God, the transcendence and otherness of God in relation to the world and in relation to the conceptual network of determinations that are there. And that transcendence is recognized in and through the failure to complete the articulation of existence. This, of course, would be a recognition of the otherness of God, of the separateness of the deity, that would be in a way ineffable. But it's something that could be experienced through the practice of the positive philosophy. I put that there as a question, whether this is Schelling or Schellingian in spirit, and whether that wouldn't be a way of establishing existence as God, but in a way that that wouldn't be limited to an articulation of that fact, but would be established through the failure to fully articulate existence as God. And in this way, I think Schelling's positive philosophy really is an effort to overcome the ideality of early German idealism, ideality understood as the overcoming of otherness. And what we have here is something like a preservation of the otherness of God and world, which ensures the determinacy of things. So thanks a lot. Sorry for going over 5 minutes, and I hope the talk was stimulating for you.